The girl was hiding in the water trough. That was the first thing Caleb Doss noticed when he stepped out of his cabin at 4:30 in the morning. Not the stars burning white overhead, not the coyotes singing their lonesome hymns past the ridge, not even the cold that had crept down from the mountains overnight and turned the mud to iron. He noticed the small, bare feet hanging over the edge of the trough and the way they weren't moving. He stopped walking, set down his lantern in the dirt, stood still the way a man stands when the world has suddenly rearranged itself around him and he's not sure yet which pieces have moved. "I can see you," he said. "Nothing. Trough's empty this time of year," he said. "Can't be comfortable." A sound came from inside, not quite a word, not quite a cry, something in between. The sound a small animal makes when it has decided that staying still is better than running. Caleb picked up his lantern and walked to the trough slowly, the way he'd approach a spooked mare. When he held the light over the edge, he saw her. She was maybe 7, maybe 8, hard to say under the grime and the bruising. She had dark hair matted against her face and wide brown eyes that had already seen too much. She was clutching something to her chest with both arms, a leather satchel, the kind with brass fittings, the kind that cost more than most families in Hatchback County earned in a month. She did not scream. She did not run. She looked up at him with those ruined eyes and said nothing at all, and somehow that silence was louder than screaming would have been. Caleb Doss was 39 years old. He had fought in a war he didn't believe in, buried a wife he did, and spent 11 years since building something quiet and small in the foothills outside the town of Hatchback, New Mexico. He kept cattle, not many, just enough. He kept to himself, not out of coldness, but out of the particular wisdom of a man who had learned that the world had teeth and that the world used them. He was not a soft man, but he was not a cruel one. "All right," he said. He reached into the trough and lifted her out the way you'd lift a child who has fallen asleep somewhere they shouldn't be, careful, steady, without drama. She let him. She kept the satchel pressed between them as he carried her. He brought her inside, sat her by the stove, boiled water for coffee and warmed milk instead. She sat in the wooden chair with the satchel in her lap and watched him move around the kitchen, and he let her watch, because being watched was better than being afraid. He set the warm milk in front of her and went back to the stove and didn't say anything else until she'd drunk half of it. "What's your name?" he asked. She looked at the cup. "Mara." "Where'd you come from, Mara?" Long pause. "The road." He could see she meant to say nothing else about it. He didn't push. He pulled out a chair from the table and sat across from her and took a long drink of his coffee, and for a while the only sound in the cabin was the stove ticking and the wind pressing itself against the window glass. "You hurt somewhere I can't see?" he asked. She shook her head, but she was lying. He could see it in the way she held herself, that careful stillness, the kind that protects a bruised rib. He let it go. There was time. He was a man who had learned to read what people weren't saying, because, in his experience, the unsaid things were always the more important ones, and what this girl wasn't saying filled up the room like smoke. She'd been running from something. That much was clear. Running hard enough to end up barefoot in a water trough before dawn, 5 miles outside the nearest town, holding a leather satchel like it was the last solid thing in the world. Whatever was in that satchel mattered. Whatever she'd run from mattered more. He didn't ask about either, not yet. He went to the back room and pulled a wool blanket from the chest at the foot of his bed, the one his wife Elena had made, the one with the blue border she'd stitched herself, and brought it back and draped it over the girl's shoulders. She looked up at him. "Get some sleep," he said. "Chair's not a bed, but it'll do." He went back to his own chair, across the room, and sat in it with his back straight and his eyes open, the way a man sits when he's decided that sleeping isn't something he's going to do that night. By the time gray light crept under the door and the roosters in the valley started their arguments, she was asleep in the chair, chin on her chest, both arms still locked around that satchel. Caleb Doss sat and watched the door. Because here is what he hadn't said out loud, what he'd registered the moment he lifted her from the trough and felt the weight of that bag and saw the initials stamped in gold on its brass clasp. HWV. Three letters that every man, woman, and child in Hatchback County knew. Three letters that belonged to one man in the entire territory. Senator Harold Winston Vance. And whatever was in that bag, whatever this child had run through the dark with, bleeding and barefoot, it was his. Somewhere out on the road to the south, Caleb could hear the faint, deliberate sound of hoofbeats. They were not coming fast, they were coming steady. He heard them slow before the ridge. 2 horses, maybe 3. They weren't pushing. Men who push their horses in the dark are men in a panic, and these men were not panicking. These were men who were certain of where they were going and in no particular rush, because certainty is its own kind of patience. Caleb was at the window before the sound fully registered, his hand already on the rifle leaning against the wall. The girl stirred. "Stay down," he said, without raising his voice. She looked at him, fully awake the way only frightened children and old soldiers can be, 0 to alert with no space between. She slid from the chair and crouched below the window line without being told twice, still holding the satchel. 3 riders came around the eastern bend. They wore their hats low. One of them carried a lantern on a post beside his saddle. They stopped 50 yards from the cabin and stayed there, and Caleb watched them through the glass. One rider leaned toward the other and said something. The second one pointed at the cabin. The third, the largest, seated on a gray roan that stood a full hand taller than the others, turned his head slowly and seemed to look directly at the window where Caleb stood. Caleb stepped back, not from fear but from discipline. "How long have you been running?" he asked the girl quietly. "Since dark," she whispered. That meant at least 8 hours. She'd come from somewhere, run all night, and ended up here, and they'd tracked her to within 100 yards of his front door. He crossed to her, crouched so they were eye level. "Who are those men?" She didn't hesitate. "Vance's men." "What's in the satchel, Mara?" She looked at him the way children look at adults when they're deciding whether to trust, that terrible, suspended moment where everything hangs in the balance. Then she opened the satchel. Inside were papers, not just any papers, ledger pages, letters with wax seals broken, a small black journal, and 2 photographs. Caleb took one photograph, held it to the light coming through the upper glass. A room, men he didn't recognize gathered around a table, and on the table stacks of currency, and beside the currency, a document. He couldn't read the document from the photograph, but he could read the face of the man seated at the head of the table, the man who was smiling at the camera the way powerful men smile when they believe themselves untouchable. Senator Harold Winston Vance. Caleb set the photograph down. His jaw was doing the thing it did when he was processing something large, working slowly side to side, like a man chewing stone. "Where'd you get this?" he asked. "My father had it," she said. "He said if anything happened to him, I should run." And something happened to him. Not a question, she answered it anyway with her eyes. Caleb stood up. He paced the length of the cabin once, then twice, then stopped at the window again. The 3 riders hadn't moved. They were waiting, for daylight maybe, for orders, or for him to make a mistake. Here was the decision, and he knew it completely. He could open the door. He could walk out and tell those men he'd found the girl wandering, that he didn't know nothing about any satchel, and hand her over and go back to his quiet life and his small herd and his cabin in the foothills, and probably, they'd leave him alone. Probably. That was one path. The other path led somewhere he could not yet see, but could already feel, the way you feel weather coming before the clouds arrive. That low, electric shift in the air that tells you something large and unavoidable is on its way. He looked at the girl. She looked back at him, and she didn't beg. That was the thing that decided it in the end. Not her fear, not her bruises, not even the photographs in that satchel. It was the fact that she didn't beg. She just looked at him with those exhausted brown eyes and waited for him to be whatever he was going to be. "All right," he said, same word as the night before, same quiet finality. He took the blanket off her shoulders, Elena's blanket with the blue stitching and draped it over the satchel, picked it up and put it in the bottom of the dry goods chest under the flour sacks. Then he took the girl by the hand and led her to the back room. "There's a loose board under the bed," he said. "Second from the east wall, it comes up. Underneath there's a space about so deep." He showed her with his hands. "You're small enough." She looked at the space, looked at him. "Take the satchel," he said, handing it back. "Don't make a sound, whatever you hear, understand?" "Yes, sir." "They." Nd Mara, he stopped. He was not a man who said unnecessary things, and what he said next would cost him something, and he knew it. "I'm not going to let anything happen to you." She nodded. No theatrics, no tears. She simply took the satchel, crawled under the bed, and disappeared beneath the board. Caleb straightened up, smoothed his shirt, walked back to the front room, lifted his rifle from the wall, checked the load, set it beside the door within reach, and then opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. The morning was grey and cold and still. The three riders were exactly where they'd been. The large man on the roan looked at him. "Morning," Caleb said. "Morning," the large man said. He had a wide, flat face and small eyes, and the kind of voice that expected to be obeyed. "You see a girl come through this way? Young, dark hair." Caleb scratched the back of his neck. "Come through about an hour ago," he said. "Barefoot, strange little thing, heading north toward Beaumont's Creek." "Pause." "North," the large man repeated. "North," Caleb confirmed, said she was looking for her aunt. The large man looked at the other two. Something passed between them. Then he looked back at Caleb with those small eyes, and Caleb held his gaze and kept his face as flat and readable as a fence post. "Obliged," the large man said. They turned their horses. Caleb watched them go. He stood on the porch until the sound of hooves faded, and then stood 5 minutes longer, because he was not a man who stopped being careful the moment danger seemed to pass. When he went back inside, he found a rider had split off from the group and circled back east. He was being watched, he was certain of it. By noon, the town of Hatchback knew. He'd ridden in for supplies, a calculated move, the kind where staying home looks guiltier than showing your face. He tied his horse at the post outside Fenner's General and walked inside, and the conversation inside stopped the way conversation stops when the subject of it has just walked through the door. Fenner, behind the counter, gave him a look that was half sympathy and half warning. He bought flour, he bought salt, he listened. In the back, two ranchers were talking in lowered voices about a search party. Senator Vance had put out a bounty, not through the sheriff's office, but through private channels. $50 for information on a stolen document, $50 more for the return of the documents themselves, $100 for the person who took them. The person who took them was a 7-year-old girl. Caleb paid for his supplies and walked out, and as he untied his horse, Sheriff Roy Lund came across the street toward him with the particular saunter of a man who has been waiting for an opportunity. Roy Lund had been sheriff for 6 years. He was a small man who'd learned to compensate for smallness with a certain kind of deliberate cruelty, the kind that presented itself as law and order but was really just the exercise of power by whoever held the badge. He was Vance's man, everyone knew it, no one said it. "Caleb," he said. "Roy, here there was some trouble out your way last night." "Nothing I noticed," Caleb said, checking his saddlebag. "Vance's men came through, said they were looking for something." Lund paused, resettled his hat. "You see anything unusual?" Caleb looked at him. "I see unusual things every day I have to come into town," he said. Lund's jaw tightened. "This isn't a social visit, Doss." "Didn't think it was." "The senator is personally involved in this matter. I'd advise any man in this county to take that seriously." "I always take the senator seriously," Caleb said, with precisely the tone that meant the opposite. He stepped up into the stirrup and settled into the saddle. "I'll keep my eyes open." He rode out of town at a walking pace, not looking back, feeling the stare between his shoulder blades like a brand. He gave it half a mile before he let himself think clearly. They were looking hard, and Lund was going to be the instrument of it. That meant the law, what passed for law in Hatchback County, was working against him, which meant he had no official recourse, no place to take the girl and the satchel and say, here, do what's right, because the people who were supposed to do what was right had already been bought by the man who needed the doing wrong protected. He was halfway home when he saw the smoke. It was thin at first, a pale thread rising from the tree line above his property line, the kind of smoke that could be a campfire. But he knew his land, and he knew there was nothing in that direction worth camping near. He pushed the horse faster. When he crested the ridge, he saw it, his barn half consumed, the old hay inside burning hot, the east wall already gone. 2 of his cattle were scattered across the field, wide-eyed, and the horse in the paddock had broken through the fence and was running. He rode in fast, got down, got the remaining livestock moving away from the fire. There was nothing to save of the barn. It was too far gone for one man with a bucket, so he didn't try. He let it burn and walked the perimeter, reading the ground. Boot prints, 3 sets, maybe 4, nails pulled from the door to keep it from looking forced. Someone had found his property from the south road, come in through the tree line, set the fire and left. Professional work, the message kind. They hadn't gone into the cabin, not yet. He went inside, went to the back room. Mara. Rustling beneath the floorboard, her face appeared pale and tight. I smelled smoke. The barn, he said, you stay put. Are they coming back? He crouched beside the board. He owed her the truth and he knew it. Probably, he said, but not tonight. Tonight they want me thinking, scared. Are you scared? He looked at her for a moment. Put the board back, he said. He went outside and stood in the field with his barn burning behind him, and he thought about Elena, who had helped him build that barn, and he thought about the photographs in the satchel, and he thought about a small girl who had run through the night because her father told her to run, and he thought about Senator Harold Winston Vance, who had held a dinner in this county last spring and given a speech about God and family and the sacred bonds of community. By the time the barn fell into its own coals, Caleb had made every decision he was going to make. He went inside, sat at the table, took out paper and began to write a letter, long and careful, with details and names and places, and at the end of it he folded both photographs inside and sealed it with wax. He knew a man in Santa Fe, a journalist, old and stubborn and not for sale, which was increasingly rare. If Caleb could get the satchel's contents to him, the story would run before Vance could stop it. The problem was getting there. Outside, past the dying glow of the barn, at the edge of the tree line, something moved. A shadow repositioned itself against a darker shadow. They hadn't left, they were watching. He was already surrounded. She came out from under the floor on her own. He hadn't called for her, he'd gone back to his chair by the stove, the letter sealed on the table in front of him, and he was sitting in the particular way he sat when he was thinking problems through to their ends, elbows on knees, hands folded, staring at the middle distance. He heard the board shift and her small feet on the floor and the sound of her crossing the room, and then she stood beside him and held out her hand. In her palm was a silver coin, old, worn smooth, the face almost gone. He looked at it. My father gave it to me, she said. He said it was his father's. He said it was for courage. She paused. He said when you're most afraid, you hold it and you remember that the fear ends. She pressed it into his hand. You should have it. He stared at the coin. He was a man who had been through more than a man should, and he had long since sealed off the part of himself that could be moved easily. But something about the gravity of a child's generosity, the total seriousness with which she gave the only thing she had left of her father, that found the seal and pressed against it. Sit down, he said after a moment. She sat across from him. Tell me about your father, he said. She was quiet for a beat. He was a clerk, she said, for the Territorial Land Office. She looked at her hands. He kept records. He thought records were important. He used to say that the truth doesn't disappear just because powerful people want it to. He said it just goes quiet for a while. Caleb turned the coin over in his fingers. He found something, she said, in the records, about Senator Vance and land grants, big ones out in the Eastern Flats. He said the grants were fraudulent, that Vance had been filing false surveys for 3 years, claiming land that belonged to other people, settlers, families, and rerouting it to his own holdings through shell names. She swallowed. He said it was hundreds of thousands of acres. He said families had been removed from land they'd worked for years and never told why. The weight of it settled over the room. He made copies, she said, the photographs, the ledger pages. He said he was going to send them to someone in Santa Fe. She looked up. 2 nights ago, men came to our house. I heard. She stopped, restarted. I heard my father tell me to run, and I ran. She didn't say what she'd heard after that, and Caleb didn't ask. He set the coin on the table between them. Your father was a brave man, he said. He was scared all the time, she said simply. He just didn't stop anyway. Caleb looked at the coin for a long moment. Then he said, that's what brave is. She seemed to consider this seriously, the way children consider things that matter to them. Then she nodded, a single slow nod, like something had been confirmed. Why are you helping me? She asked. You don't know me. He picked up the coin, held it, set it back down. My wife, he said. Elena, she died 4 years ago. Fever took her faster than it had any right to. He paused. We never had children. She wanted them. I wasn't always easy to live with. I was better with animals than with people most days. She used to say that. A thin, sad, almost smile. She'd have liked you, I think. She'd have liked the way you don't beg. Mara looked at him with those brown eyes that were too old for her face. I thought about it, she said quietly, begging. I know, he said. You held yourself back. That takes more strength than people think. They sat in silence for a while, and it was a different kind of silence than before, not the silence of strangers in proximity, but the silence of people who have said enough that more words aren't needed right away. Then she said, what's going to happen to us? He unfolded the letter he'd written, laid it flat. There's a man in Santa Fe, James Calloway. He works for the territorial newspaper. He's old and he's difficult and he doesn't much care for anyone telling him what to print. He tapped the letter. I need to get this to him, the satchel too. How old? I have a neighbor, he said. Henry Brace, lives up the North Road about 3 miles. He owes me nothing, which means he has nothing to fear yet, and he has a nephew in Santa Fe. He stood and went to the window. The tree line was dark and still. The watcher was still there, he could feel him, but he was a watcher, not a mover, and that meant he was under orders to observe. I can't leave without being followed, he said, but I can send him alone. He glanced back at her, Henry. And us, she said. We don't run, he said. Not yet. If we run, we look like what they want us to look like. We stay here, quiet, normal, and we wait for Santa Fe. She thought about this. What if Calloway doesn't help? Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then we'll have done what we could with what we had, he said. She reached out and picked up the coin from the table and walked back to him and pressed it into his hand again, closing his fingers around it. Then you'll need this more than me, she said. He looked down at his closed fist. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Outside, the watcher in the tree line shifted his weight, and twigs cracked in the cold silence, and neither of them flinched. Henry Brace came before dawn. Caleb had sent the signal, a lantern hung from the north fence post, steady light, no movement, the kind of message that old neighbors read without needing it explained. When Henry's boots sounded on the porch boards, Caleb let him in without a word, showed him the satchel, showed him the letter, and said 2 sentences. I need your nephew to carry this to James Calloway at the Santa Fe Territorial Gazette. Tell him a girl's life depends on it. Henry Brace was 61 years old and had homesteaded this valley when it was still Comanche territory, and he'd been too young and too stubborn to be afraid. He looked at the satchel. He looked at Mara, sitting at the table with Elena's blanket around her shoulders. How long do I have? He asked. 2 days, Caleb said, maybe less. Henry picked up the satchel. He left without breakfast. By the second morning, Sheriff Lund arrived with 4 men. They came up the road in a tight group, not trying to hide it, which meant they'd moved past the quiet phase. Caleb watched them through the window and told Mara to stay in the back room, not under the floor this time, because there was nothing to hide now. The evidence was gone. He walked out onto the porch before they reached the gate. Caleb Doss, Lund said, pulling up his horse. I have authorization from Senator Vance's office to search this property. For what? Caleb said. Stolen property, territorial documents. Search what you like, Caleb said. He stepped aside. Wipe your boots. Lund's eyes narrowed. He hadn't expected that. He sent 2 men inside. Caleb stood on the porch and watched the tree line and the road and the faces of the 2 men who'd stayed on horseback, and he breathed the cold morning air and thought about Elena and about a coin worn smooth by 3 generations of frightened hands. The men came out. They found nothing. No satchel, no papers, no photographs. Just a cabin, a stove, a dry goods chest, and a 7-year-old girl sitting quietly on a bed, who looked at them with wide brown eyes and said nothing at all. Lund stood in the yard and looked at Caleb for a long time. You're making a mistake, Lund said. I've made bigger ones, Caleb said. Lund left, but he took 1 man and posted him at the road, watching. The watcher remained there for 3 days. On the 4th morning, he was gone. Caleb didn't know why, not yet. He kept Mara close, kept to the property, cooked simple meals and taught her to play cards, and repaired what he could of the burned-out fence posts that edged where the barn had been. She helped without being asked. She was good with her hands, better than she should have been at her age, which told him something about the kind of childhood she'd had, the kind where you learn early that useful things must be done by whoever is nearest to them. On the 6th day, a rider came from the south with a newspaper. The Santa Fe Territorial Gazette, front page. Senator Harold Winstonvance, named in fraudulent land grant scheme. Territorial documents reveal decades of deception. Hundreds of homestead families displaced illegally. James Calloway's byline, 2 full columns, every name, every date, every fraudulent survey, every bribed official. The photographs described in precise and damning detail. A federal inquiry already announced. Vance's office unreachable for comment. Caleb read the article once, set the paper on the table, looked out the window. Mara read it twice, slowly, with her finger moving under each line. When she finished, she set the paper down carefully, with both hands, the way you set something down that you want to treat with respect. He said the truth just goes quiet for a while, she said. He was right, Caleb said. She looked up at him. There were tears on her face, and she didn't seem to notice them or didn't mind. Stop crying, he said, not unkindly. I'm no hero. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. That's exactly what my father said, she said, right before he did something heroic. He didn't have an answer for that. He poured 2 cups of coffee, 1 black, 1 with milk and sugar that he'd started keeping because she preferred it, and they sat at the table together and didn't say anything more, because sometimes the things that need saying have already been said. Senator Harold Winston Vance resigned his seat 41 days later. A federal marshal came for him at his estate outside Albuquerque on a Tuesday morning in October. He came quietly. There is often something almost dignified in the resignation of power, as though the powerful believe, even at the end, that they can control the manner of their falling. He could not. His land holdings were seized. 2/3 of them were ultimately returned to the families who had been displaced. Not all, not perfectly, but enough to matter. 11 men who had worked as his fixers or his hands were charged with various crimes, including the arson of Caleb Doss's barn and the death of one Daniel Reyes, Clark, age 44, Mara's father, whose body was found in the river outside Hatchback 3 days after the story ran, weighted with stones, as if someone believed that what was in the river would stay there. It did not stay there. Sheriff Roy Lund lost his badge in November and his freedom in December. James Calloway won the Territorial Press Award for investigative reporting, accepted it at a dinner in Santa Fe, and gave a speech that lasted 4 minutes and consisted almost entirely of praise for a man in the foothills outside Hatchback who he said had done something simple and rare. He'd chosen right over safe. Caleb did not attend the dinner. He was not a dinner kind of man. Mara Reyes spent the winter in the cabin in the foothills. In the spring, a letter came from her aunt in Denver, her father's sister, who had read the newspapers and spent weeks searching. The letter was long and full of the grief of a woman who had lost her brother and was trying to put the world back into some recognizable shape. She wanted Mara to come. Mara sat with the letter for a day. Then she asked Caleb what he thought, and he said, with the particular plainness of a man who will not put his own need ahead of what's right, that she should go, that she had family, and family was worth more than she knew yet. She argued, he waited her out. He was patient the way only people who have stopped being in a hurry ever truly are. She left on a Wednesday in a wagon that Henry Brace drove to the rail station at Morrow's Creek, where she would catch the North Line to Denver. Before she climbed up, she pressed something into Caleb's hand, the coin. He tried to give it back, and she stepped up into the wagon and looked at him from the height of the seat and said, "You keep it. You know what to do with it." He closed his fingers around it. He stood in the yard and watched the wagon go until it was a shape against the sky, and then until it was nothing at all. Years later, when she was a woman grown and had children of her own, and told them stories of the West the way you tell children's stories, with certain details sharpened and others softened, the way memory always works, she would tell them about a cowboy in the foothills who was not a hero, who had a burned-out barn and a dead wife's blanket and a coin he carried in his left pocket always, who did not do what he did because it was easy or safe or wise. Who did it be? Echoes a child looked at him without begging, and he could not find it in himself to be a man who walked away from that. She would tell them his name. She would tell them what he said. And she would tell them that sometimes the most important thing a person can be is not brave, not strong, not wise, but simply, stubbornly, quietly unwilling to be what the world is trying to make them. Back in the foothills, in the cabin in the October quiet, Caleb Doss sat on his porch as the last of the day's light pulled itself across the valley and faded. The air smelled of pine and coming cold. The new fence posts stood straight and pale where the barn had been. He'd built them himself, alone, one morning when the work felt necessary. He took the coin from his pocket, turned it in his fingers, face almost gone, edges worn to silk. He held it the way a man holds something old and true, and without adequate explanation. Then he put it back, tipped his hat to nobody in particular. And the last light of the territory went gold, then red, then dark, the way all western skies do, slowly, beautifully, without apology.